All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're all doing great out there. Thank you all for watching. In this video, I will continue my discussion of Thomas Hobbes. So we've already touched on his biography and done some stage setting, looked at his worldview, his mechanistic materialism, his empiricist epistemology, and his natural law theory. We've talked about some of the basics of a natural law theory and how Hobbes finds himself in the natural law tradition by accepting one and two. Hobbes doesn't seem to have much in much to say about three, where there's mention of God's laws being designed to perfect human nature and to help us flourish. Um, you might think something like that at the end of the day, but at least the way Hobbes is traditionally understood is the natural laws is provided to us by God for the sake of our self-preservation and for the enhancement of our well-being. Okay. Um, so the perfection of human nature point to something, as I see it, Hobbes doesn't deal with. And remember, his theory has an egoistic flavor, meaning that the fundamental principles, normative or ethical principles of his philosophy, of his natural law theory, will end up being egoistic in nature, meaning self-regarding. When we do political philosophy, so let's segue to that. What we do really are a number of things. I'm trying to give you just a sense of what political philosophy is by looking at 1 through 6 on this slide here. So when you do political philosophy, you're going to say something about the nature of a political society, like what distinguishes a political society from a non-political society, or people living in what's called a state of nature, as you likely know about from reading the Hobbes, or maybe you know from some other course you've taken. It's also concerned with the justification of political societies, like what makes political authority, political obedience justified, what makes a political society legitimate. 3, the best ways to organize a political society. So do we organize by way of an absolute power, non-absolute power? What form of government should a political society have? Should it be monarchical? Should it be based on aristocracy, democracy, etc.? And then what kinds of political institutions should we create therein? 4, the responsibility and rights of citizens. So when you do political philosophy, okay, well, what responsibility do citizens have? What rights do they have? So think about how you might think that when you work out a political philosophy, you want to okay, government's one of its main functions is to protect people's rights. Well, what are the nature of those rights? And here in the US, we might look to our Bill of Rights as a guide to thinking about, well, what are the fundamental ones? And then 5, the responsibility and authority of governments. So what is the role of a government in a political society? We know that that when we have a political society, there's a government in place, but what's their job? What's their function? Okay, and what kind of authority do they have? And 6, the natures and of the relationship between things like equality, justice, and liberty. Okay, like which among these might be preeminent or more fundamental, or are they all equally fundamental? We work out a system with that in mind. So let's just give you a sense of what philosophers do when they do political philosophy. It's not to give you the essence of political philosophy, but just to give you a flavor of it. Okay. And I think by the time we get to the end of looking at Hobbes in this video, we'll be able to look back at these and say a few words at the very least about most of them, about what Hobbes says about these topics in political philosophy. Okay, so big picture. So let's make sure that we're at the outset very, very clear about Hobbes's political philosophy. So we're kind of zooming out a bit here so we can see the general structure as opposed to the details of things. So first thing to note is, one, that Hobbes, he rejects the divine right of kings theory. So even though if you're reading the Hobbes and you've read more than I even assigned of the text, or you've read Hobbes before, he does mention the gods in relation to monarchs. He rejects the theory that what establishes political authority, earthly political authority, um, is God. Okay, he thinks that, but there's another theory in the offing. So, as I say, Divine Right King's theory, DRKT, is a theory that God is a source of legitimate political society. So, like, when is a monarch ruling legitimately? When does he have proper authority to rule? Well, according to DRKT, when God has made it so. Now, Hobbes wants a picture of political philosophy that isn't putting God at the center of earthly power. And so he thinks we need something like a more enlightened account of political authority, one that could be based on, you know, consent, the consent of those who are governed, as opposed to just saying that God ordains or favors that individual over there to rule over all these other people. So, so this is, Hobbes's political philosophy, for all of its flaws, is supposed to be a more enlightened conception of political philosophy. So he accepts, as I note here in 2, the social contract theory of political authority. His big picture theory of political philosophy is social contract theory. So social contract theory, SCT for short, claims that the consent of the governed is necessary for political legitimacy. Okay, so that's the big picture claim. Okay, so then, Hobbes can say things like, well, when you're punished in a political society, in a legitimate political society, well, you've consented in advance to that punishment. So Hobbes, like many political philosophers, thinks that that the role of political society, the role of government within political society, is to make and enforce laws, punish people who break those laws, where, um, yeah, in a very general way, the government, its role is to serve as a kind of monopoly on coercion or of, of violence on people. So when people commit crimes, they can be subjected to various forms of punishment or violence for their offenses. And that's supposed to keep people in line. Now, when you say that just some king anointed by God has the right to do that, that doesn't seem doesn't seem enlightened enough for this sort of new era of philosophy. Remember, this early modern, this new era of philosophy that Hobbes is writing and that he's really helping create. And so this idea of consent, the consent of the governed, is one that seems far more enlightened. So when someone's punished, when they have violence subjected to them for their misdeeds, for their criminal activity, right? Hobbes could say, well, they consented to that in advance by consenting to the political society in question. Okay, more to say about consent as these videos go on, as our discussion of social contract theory goes on. But 3, Hobbes uses the concept of the state of nature, which I mentioned just a few moments ago, to guide the foundational questions of political philosophy. So we think about things like what makes a political society legitimate, or what is the nature of political society. I mean, like these really foundational questions of political philosophy. There's a theoretical tool that Hobbes uses, which he thinks has empirical support, some kind. This idea of a state of nature, people living without a common political authority. Okay, so a state of nature, in its essence, for Hobbes and for others in the tradition, is a state without common political authority. It's our natural state. Sometimes it's said we become socialized. We become part of a political society when political authority and political obedience and et cetera exist. Okay, so our natural state is a state of nature. So there's something about being in a state of nature and then going from that to a political society that's going to play a role in helping us think carefully about questions like what is a political society and what justifies one. And then a whole host of other issues too, but that's at least those 2 topics are at the top of our mind when thinking about the state of nature and its role in Hobbes. So state of war, and the way I think about it, this is, you know, based on my long time studying of Hobbes. The state of nature is defined, let's go back to the previous slide, and I hope this is a helpful discussion. The state of nature is defined in this very broad way. And this is me, you know, extrapolating from the text, you know, after years of studying it, that this is what's essential to a state of nature. And the state of nature can manifest itself in different ways. So one way in which it can manifest itself is people living together in prehistorical times. So prehistorical meaning we don't have written records or the like. Okay, so archaeologists might uncover prehistorical information with their work, but this is at least one version of a state of nature, and Hobbes isn't always entirely clear on this in his work. So I like to try to make it as clear as possible that when Hobbes writes about the state of nature, very often he's talking about this prehistorical version of the state of nature. Okay, and then of course a state of nature can manifest itself in different ways. There could be, you know, not just people living together without political power in the distant past, but then you can imagine different political societies in relation to each other where there's no common political power between them count as a state of nature on this definition. You know, an individual or a group of individuals, you know, not part of a political society in relation to a political society or set of political societies for that matter, constitutes on this definition a kind of state of nature. So there are these different kinds of states of nature. The one that's most relevant for our purposes is this prehistorical version, because Hobbes, and as we're going to see, Locke seems to focus on this version as well. Okay, so I'm not trying to get too far ahead here with thinking about this concept of state of nature, but I'm planting a seed for what's to come. So it's important to think about how explicitly the state of nature is defined here, and then how narrowly we can understand it, in the sense that we can understand it in different we can understand it narrowly in different ways as different manifestations of a state of nature. So one, this is the prehistorical version of it, as we find in Hobbes. Find my Hobbes reading. So if you go to chapter 13, and I have some passages to look at, but I start here because this is like really where we get this discussion of the natural condition, which is a state of nature. Okay. So there's no common political power. There's scarce resources. There's equality of a mental and physical kind. There's limited altruism, which is a motivational thesis. It's a thesis about how we're motivated to act. So it's a psychological claim, right? So think about how our motivations are part of our psychology. And the claim here, when we say that people are in their natural state limitedly altruistic, just means that we're by and large egoistic or self-interested. That doesn't mean that we're completely so. We do act for the sake of others. Sometimes we act for the sake of others when we shouldn't, on Hobbes's view. But still, this is a motivational claim, a psychological claim, not the moral claim, which claims that we should act in an altruistic way. If we're thinking about altruism in the ethical sense, there's also egoism in the ethical sense, which is a claim about how we should act. We should act such that we're promoting our self-interest. So just keep in mind the difference between a motivational thesis and an ethical thesis. This is the motivational one here. And then rational foresight. Okay, so in our natural state, we have reason, and we use our reason to look into the future, which we do so very imperfectly, in order to plan. Okay, in order to big picture plan, and then we're free. So in our natural state, we're very free. Okay, Hobbes might want to say, like, there's a sense in which, like, we're like perfectly free to do whatever we want in a state of nature. So here, I've got the 6 prehistorical state of nature conditions that Hobbes emphasizes in chapter 13. But now I want to go just say a bit more about them. So conditions 1 and 2 on this slide. So 1, there's no common political power, so there's no political authority over people, thus no earthly power to enforce the laws of nature. Okay. Okay, so remember, he's a natural law theorist. So the moral laws that are supposed to govern our behaviors um, are um, are these natural laws, or laws of nature, sometimes they're called. So let natural law and laws of nature be used interchangeably if that's helpful. And here we're talking about moral laws, not the laws of the natural world, or the laws of physics. Perhaps that's better to say that, because in a sense, Hobbes thinks that everything that exists is natural. And 1b, keep in mind the other way states of nature can exist. So I've mentioned that already. Okay, so 1a and 1b, we're good with that. Scarce resources, too little technologies available to make nature usable, to make the resources less scarce. So many people, when they start doing political philosophy, or probably more exactly economics, they kind of start with this idea of there being scarce resources, and that's the foundation for thinking about economics, economic theory. And the 2b, competition for scarce resources is a source of war in a state of nature, in our natural state. So there'll be scarce resources. There's no common political power, so there's no earthly authority. Okay. And people will be competing for the scarce resources, and they're going to need these resources to be kept alive. So you can imagine the competition. It's not like sport, it's like life or death. That's why it's a motivation, or um, a source of war, source of battle, a source of preparing for battle, even. So here's condition 3. This is the equality condition, and I add here distrust, because equality are being all roughly equal will create distrust. So in Leviathan, page 56 in the Early Modern translations, Hobbes writes, nature has made men so equal in their physical and mental capacities that although sometimes we may find one man who is obviously stronger in body or quicker of mind than another, yet taking all in all, the difference between one and another is not so great that one man can claim to have any advantage of strength or skill or the like that just can't be as well claimed by some others. As for strength of body, the weakest man is strong enough to kill the strongest, either by secret plot or by an alliance with others who are in the same danger as he is in, or that he is in. So no worries if someone's stronger. Just find a secret way to kill the person, kill them while they're sleeping, or team up, okay, with other people who are smaller to take down the larger fella who you're competing with for the scarce resources. So this is life or death in our natural state. So it'd be hard to like put ourselves in the mindset of imagining this, but I think it's important to do so because it helps us appreciate this concept of a state of nature. Um, um, so we don't live in a world like where the resources are that scarce to where we're struggling to get enough to eat, enough to drink, especially in a developed country like ours where food and drink and resources are quite abundant. Okay, so in that regard, we're living in like superb times in human history. There might be other ways in which we're not, but at least with respect to that, we are. So, but try to put yourself in the mindset where you're thinking about this concept of state of nature. We're living in a natural state where we don't have abundant resources. The resources are extremely scarce. Okay, and everyone's roughly equal at getting them. Okay, and if that's the case, then well, that's going to create a lot of distrust in people. Okay, he calls it diffidence in the text. So that's the third condition. So the focus is on mental and physical equality, not moral equality. Why? Well, Hobbes doesn't think that we're morally equal. In a chapter I did have you read chapter 10 of Leviathan, Hobbes is quite clear that our value, our worth has a price or value. See if I can find the quick passage. It's kind of happens quickly. I didn't have you read this, but just in case you're interested and you wanted to know it in the future. Oops. Yeah, right here. So this is on page 37 or 39, sorry. Sorry, it took me a long time. I'm used to reading my text, but I've been using this because it's free for my students. I'm having to get used to it and used to finding things. The value or worth of a man is like the value of anything, his price. That is, say, the amount that would be given for the use of his power. So it's not absolute, but it's conditional because it depends on someone else's need and judgment. Okay. So this seems to be a view that there's no sort of intrinsic absolute value that all human beings have that we see developed in subsequent philosophers in the social contract tradition as well. The kind of view that developed in the Western tradition at the very least, and in others, but the one that I'm most familiar with is the Western tradition, with this idea of having an absolute kind of intrinsic moral worth that's, equally distributed among people, but not according to Hobbes. That's why he's not focusing on mental equality. Moral equality is focusing on mental and physical equality. Okay, we'll see when we get to Locke that he's more interested in the moral equality. Okay, conditions 4 and 5. So we have limited altruism, and this is motivational thesis. We seek the good of others in limited and perfect and imperfect ways. Okay, so oftentimes we seek the good of those who are closest to us, our family and our friends. But Hobbes is open to the idea that, that it's empirically true that sometimes we help people who aren't our family or our friends. He's well aware of the fact that we're quite imperfect in our attempts to help other people when we do so. Okay. Um, um, but we more commonly seek our own good, our own individual good. It just happens kind of innately like that. But also in imperfect ways. So very often we'll cut off our noses to spite our faces, meaning that sometimes we'll think we're doing something that's good for us, but it turns out to be bad for us. So even though we're motivated by something that we think is good for us, doesn't mean that we always are doing that. In fact, we very often aren't. Okay, and this is, one of the reasons why some people think that Hobbes inclines towards something like an ethical, egoist, natural law theories, because we need to get better at promoting our own good. Okay, and if people were just better at promoting their own good, for Hobbes that means being more rational, as it turns out, then our lives would go better for us, but so would the lives of others around us go better for them. Okay, so hopefully this limited altruism discussion makes sense. And again, let's highlight this as a motivational thesis. Okay. Often there's a connection in understanding his Hobbes' motivational thesis to understanding his moral thesis, his ethical thesis, but we'll keep them separate. Rational foresight. So I've mentioned this already, but we use our rational faculty to plan. And planning requires using foresight. We have to look into the world to see what we want to do with it. Okay, so we think about what we're doing when we plan is we have intentions to change the world in accordance with what we have up here, right, in our minds. Okay, so we have to look at the world, see the way it is, and then predict the way it's going to be in order to bring about the relevant changes, things that we want the world to be like. Kind of cool if you think about it. I don't know how often we step back and reflect on things like what we're doing when we plan, but that's at least big picture what we're doing, right? In terms of broad outline of what we're doing. And so this requires using foresight. And we seek to win. Ultimately, Hobbes thinks that only God has the ability to predict the future. But we can look to the future and make good guesses, know the probabilities to some degree. 5b, we seek to win the scarce resources available by the planning. Okay. And winning glory is a key motivation for war. Okay. And um, so it turns out that glory, dominating others, is a key motivation for war, on Hobbes's view. So we don't want to just, get the resources. We want to do so in a way that glorifies us, ourselves. We want to see ourselves, vainly admired and honored and given value from others. So remember, passage I read from chapter 10 now comes back, which I didn't have you read, mind you, but I just read it to you. Right? The value that others bestow on us. That's where our worth comes from. So we want this kind of glory. Okay. So we have these three key motivations for battle. We have competition for the scarce resources. We have distrust in others due from that falls out of thinking about our equality, but our mental and physical equality, and then winning, this glory idea, being a key motivation for war. And the condition 6, freedom. Everyone has a right to everything because no one has a right to anything. Now, for those of you interested in the topic of free will, typically every term I have some students are interested in that topic. I'll just say one brief thing that's sort of separate from 6a here, separate from the slide, that may interest you, pique your interest. But Hobbes is someone in the tradition who thinks that there's a sense in which everything we do is determined by at least what's going on in our head psychologically. So everything that happens maybe in the universe is mechanistically determined, but we're sort of just part of the broader, large machine of the universe. The local sort of sources of determinism are psychological, our beliefs and our desires, our motivations, etc. Um, he thinks that we can be determined but free at the same time. He's called incompatibilist. So he's one of these early philosophers in the tradition, in the early modern tradition, who comes along with what we call a compatibilist theory of freedom, which maintains that we can be both free and determined with respect to an action. The traditional view, the more orthodox traditional view, has been that if you're determined to do something, whether it be by something in your psychology or something outside of your psychology, you can't thereby be free with respect to that thing, with respect to that action that's performed. In fact, it might not even count as an action. Okay, so that's some of the metaphysics of free will that may intrigue some of you. But let's get back to freedom here, thinking about our natural state, are living in a state of nature. 6a, everyone has a right to everything because no one has a right to anything. But this seems paradoxical. So how are we to understand it? So let's be a slogan to guide us of thinking about our freedom. Everyone has a right to everything because no one has a right to anything. Okay, so like I have a right to whatever will help me self-preserve. That means that could be other people. It could be my neighbor's wife or children that I use to get more resources. It could be whatever resource they've stockpiled. And this means I could kill to self-preserve. I have the right to do all that in my natural state. Okay, because I have a right to self-preserve. Okay, a right to improve my well-being in my natural state. And there's no earthly authority, as it were, to prevent me from doing these things. There might be other human beings that try to stop me, but they don't have any earthly authority over me. So they can try to stop me, but if I get what I want, it's mine. Okay, so how can we understand this to avoid um, uh, this just being a contradiction? So a paradox is just an apparent contradiction. So when you explain away the paradox, or if you explain, the paradox, you explain away the contradiction. So here's how we do so. Everyone, has a natural right. So it turns out that the term right in 6 is ambiguous. Okay. There's two different ways of understanding rights here. So everyone has a natural right. Right? So everyone in their natural state has the right. So everyone has a natural right to everything because no one has a political right to anything. or no one has a political or property. I'll do, for example, property right to anything. Okay. So that's how we're to understand it. And the paradox goes away because now we're just talking about two different kinds of rights. So what explains why everyone has a natural right to everything is that no one has a political or property right to anything. What would be required for having a political right to something or to anything would be that there's a common political power which has the authority to enforce property rights or other political rights. So that explains away the paradox. So this slogan, right, capturing our freedom in a state of nature, is explained by this slogan. Everyone has a natural right to everything, but no one has a political right to everything. So we can have natural rights, rights in our natural state, and then we're also going to have political rights. Okay, the rights that we get from belonging to a political society. Okay, so all this leads, as you likely have noticed from the reading, and if you're able to maybe read between the lines a little bit, in this discussion, to Hobbes claiming that the state of nature is a state of war. So he claims this on page 57 of the Leviathan. This makes it obvious that for as long as men live without a common power to keep them all in awe. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a state of nature. People are living without a common power. So they are in a condition known as war. So if they're living in a state of nature, living in a state of war, they're living in a condition of war. And it is war of every man against every man, or every person against every person. Okay. For war doesn't consist just in battle or the act of fighting, but in a period of time which it is well enough known that people are willing to join in battle. So a state of war doesn't have to involve actual battle, just the preparation for it. Okay. Okay, then he makes this analogy to bad weather and not counting as stormy weather, but we'll set that aside. So similarly, what constitutes war is not actual fighting, but a known disposition to fight during a time when there's no assurance to the contrary. And then this crucial last bit, all other time is peace. So the world divides into these different states of war and states of peace. State of nature is a state of war, political societies, guess what? A state of peace. Okay. So that's, fascinating passage that makes explicit what Hobbes was, building up with his discussion in chapter 13. I mean, this is from chapter 13, but he's building up to this point. Okay. Okay, no, I don't need that there. All right, good. So state of nature is a state of war. Then he writes this. This is page 57 to 58. Therefore, whatever results from a time of war, when every person is enemy to every person, every man is enemy to every man, also results from a time when live with no other security, but their own strength and ingenuity provides them with. In such conditions, there is no place, and this is, the font is smaller and all this. This is what the way it works out in the text too. So there's no place for hard work. Let me make it bigger so you can see it better. There's no place for hard work because there's no assurance that it will yield results, and consequently no cultivation of the earth, no navigation or use of materials that can be imported by sea, no construction of large buildings, no machines for moving things that require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no count of time, no practical skills, no literature or scholarship, no Cal Poly, no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And here's one of the most famous parts of the Leviathan. And the life of man, the life of people, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So yeah, we're talking here about a state of nature, the prehistorical sense, and the prehistorical man lived in this kind of way, according to our friend Hobbes. Okay, when people are living in a state of nature, which is a state of war in these prehistorical times, right, this is what the world is like. Okay, people aren't going to work hard because there's no assurance that the that the hard work will yield results. Um, um, Too much warfare, too much battling, too much preparation for battling going on. No cultivation of the earth, so no farming. Okay. No animal husbandry, no navigation, right? You're not building boats and better boats, as it were, ships to sail the seas. Um, you're not building large buildings. You're building small, perhaps even portable. No machines for moving things that require much force. You don't have the technology to build the machines to um, to move earth, to flatten it out in order to build large buildings for better shelter. No knowledge of the face of the earth. Too much time having to spend existing, focusing on the necessities. Okay, not enough time to do what's required for understanding and not knowing the world. No account of time, no practical skills, no literature, no scholarship. Okay, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. That's what time was. That's what history was like. That's what prehistory was like, Hobbes is claiming. Okay, the life of man, the life of people. Hobbes seems to be using man in the general sense of human. Okay, the life of man: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Lifespans were very, very short back then. Okay, some of the work by Steven Pinker that's out there, some of you may know about, confirms at least some of this. Maybe not perfectly, but confirms at least some of it, that people were far more violent, and there's a lot more violence in prehistorical times and ancient times than in more modern times. We're living in a time of relative peace, despite what you might see on your favorite um, uh, legacy news um, reports. Okay, so leaving a state of nature, Hobbes uses the concept of state of nature to guide us in thinking about foundational issues of political philosophy, as was discussed on slide 10. So remember the number 1 through 6 that we went through there. Big picture again, let's zoom out. Hobbes believes that we can learn about the nature of political society, including its justification, by thinking about prehistorical versions of states of nature and the movement away from them to political societies, to the formation of political societies. So now we turn to Hobbes' ethics to guide us here, because we're thinking about people living in a state of war, and then what justifies ethically, you might say, that people moving from their natural state to a political state. So as I say, enter Hobbes' ethics here. Okay. So we already know he's a natural law theorist, but let's see if we can understand it, see how his natural law theory, his particular version of it, guides us. And the discussion of this is chapter 14 and 15 of Leviathan. So I had you read just a bit of chapter 15. These are rich texts, so I want to slow down and focus on the bits of them that I think are best for understanding Hobbes' political philosophy, at least the foundational aspects of it. So we know he's a natural law theorist, and here are 3 natural laws that he gives us. He gives us 19 in the text. So the first 3 are the fundamental ones. Seek peace when one can. When one can't, use a means of war to one's advantage. This is a paraphrase from the first law of nature. And then law of nature 2, make contrast with others in the way of peace. And law of nature 3, keep one's contracts. Okay, so remember, the natural law gives us these laws of nature, these moral laws, and we come to know them through the use of our reason. Perhaps our conscience is sensitive to them. So, when we're in our natural state, our reason tells us to get out. It tells us to seek peace. Remember, the peace, we saw all other states besides the state of nature, which is a state of war, were states of peace. So seek peace when one can, we seem to suggest that we need to get out of a state of nature, which is a state of war. Okay, seek peace when one can, suggesting that we're generally obligated to seek peace, but there might be circumstances in which we can't. So we find ourselves just stuck in a state of nature. And if that's true, then use the means of war to one's advantage. But live freely. Like, use the means of war to your advantage. Right? Keep in mind that you have a right to everything because nobody has a political right to anything in a state of nature. Law of nature number 2: make contracts with others in the way of peace. So this is the blueprint. This is the guide. How do we make peace? Well, we make contracts with others. We make agreements with others. When we make agreements, we're consenting. So consenting is going to be central to the move from the state of nature to political society. Agreements, consent being central means that he's in the social contract tradition, as I've tried to anticipate. And then centrally, we keep our contracts. This is really Hobbes's theory of justice. Okay, we're just when we keep the contracts agreements that we made with others. I'll say a bit more about contracts as we move forward, but so laws of nature enforcement. So Hobbes seems to believe, and I think we can extrapolate this from passages in chapter 15, a thesis like the following: a law is binding only if it's enforceable, meaning a law is one that has a kind of force on us to live up to, only if it's enforceable. So if there's no one to enforce the law, well, there you go. But now it's going to turn out that there's a couple different ways we can understand enforceability. Okay, so here we're just going to think about the laws of nature as the relevant law or the relevant laws. So one, the laws of nature aren't externally enforceable. So there's this external sense of enforceability. So they aren't externally binding. So Hobbes seems like he's going to accept one. Okay, so people are living in a state of nature. The laws of nature, they're not externally enforceable on us. Let's say that there's no one on earth who can enforce these laws on us. There's no one on earth who can come and force you to seek peace, to make contracts with others, etc. Okay, so by externally, maybe think about it in the sense of earthly enforceable. And then 2, the laws of nature are internally enforceable. So there's a sense in which they're internally enforceable. So they are internally binding. Okay, so you get the relevant enforceability, the internal enforceability in a state of nature. So now what is this? Well, who might the internal enforcer be? Well, it's God for Hobbes. So Hobbes claims that God will judge us on whether or not we lived up to the laws of nature. But that's not an earthly external enforcer. This is like a judgment day enforcer that'll happen, right, in the next life. So we'll die, and then we face the day of judgment, and then God will judge us for whether or not we lived up to the laws of nature. Did you really seek peace when you could? Did you really make contracts with others when you could? When you could have, etc. Okay. So what Hobbes says in chapter 15 is that the laws of nature, they're not externally binding on us. They are given that there's no one earthly to enforce them, they're not going to be binding on us. That part of what explains Hobbes' theory of freedom in a state of nature. But still, internal to our own souls, in foro interno is the expression, okay, as opposed to ex foro externo, for the external to our souls, okay. But internal to our souls, we always have God holding us to the laws of nature. They're moral laws, they're God's laws, okay, designed for the sake of our self-preservation and the improvement of our well-being, okay. So good. Now, that helps us understand Hobbes's ethical view. But part of the reason that the state of nature is a state of war is just that there's no enforceability. Okay, because of one, God isn't, at least empirically, God isn't enforcing the laws of nature in any kind of earthly way. That seems to happen in the afterlife, if it happens at all. Okay, so what's the argument for leaving the state of war? It's a state of for leaving the state of nature. I call it a state of war argument. That's based on thinking about his natural Hobbes's natural laws. It's a very simple argument as I see it. Here's just a sketch of it. A state of nature is a state of war, which severely compromises our well-being and even our ability to self-preserve. So not only are we living with a lot of ill-being, if I could put it that way, so our lives are filled with lots of suffering. Think about the fear you would be in constantly if Hobbes is right. Right? But not only that, like our lives are constantly in danger. Okay. So natural law 1, ln1, requires or commands us, right? So the requirement is a command. So remember, I told you when you're a natural law theorist, you want sort of the biblical or the Quranic command ethics to be preserved, but within the context of some explanation for why these commands, as opposed to others, are commanded, right, are in play. So these are commands to self-preserve and to improve our well-being, right? Seek peace when one can. That's likely to put you in a position where you can self-preserve and where you can more likely improve your well-being. That is, secure more goods for yourself, okay? Safety, okay, comfort, and all the rest. Thus, we should abandon the state of nature for political society, which is a state of, as we know, state of peace. Okay, I'll even capitalize that, a state of peace. Okay, so a state of war argument. So Hobbes uses the concept of the state of war to argue for leaving the state of nature. Okay, so now what next? We have the argument that we're guided by from our reason using the laws of nature for leaving the state of nature. But what next? Then we follow law of nature 2 and law of nature 3, which propels us forward. Okay, so we don't just um, um, uh, um, you know, we don't live without having some kind of rational understanding of what we're to do. Okay, some people might struggle, but presumably Hobbes thinks that some of us, at least some of the time, will know what to do with respect to guiding us once we're determined to leave the state of nature as we seek peace. Well, we make contracts with others in the way of peace, and we keep our contracts. So thus, people leave the state of nature, agreeing to contracts with others, agreeing fundamentally to surrender some of our natural rights, to some of their natural rights, transferring such rights to a sovereign who thereby has the authority to enforce such contracts. That's just, for our purposes, call this fundamental agreement, the original contract. So this original contract is people saying, okay, we agree that we're leaving the state of nature to form a political society. So when we do that, then we agree to surrender the right we had to everything in a state of nature. Okay, we still retain some rights, of course, but we surrender our right to everything, and we transfer those rights to a sovereign to, as it were, exercise those rights on our behalf in order to improve our lives. So it's kind of like a rational surrender and a rational transferring, recognizing that by giving up some of our freedom, some of our rights, we actually improve our lives and our chances of survival significantly. Okay, so this original agreement, this original contract, it's the subjects themselves, the citizens themselves, who are saying, hey, we surrender our right to everything. Okay, we're back. It looks like there was a little bit of a glitch there. We surrender our rights to everything. We agree to do that, and we also agree to transfer our rights to a sovereign. And when this happens, according to Hobbes, then you get your sovereign, someone who you should have a lot of awe for, a lot of respect for, and a lot of fear of. Then you have the sort of the bare bones of a political society established, and the sovereign can then start doing what sovereigns do. Okay. Okay, let me see if I can get rid of this hand that's over here. Lower hand, and then back to sharing. Okay. And so here we go. So hopefully this all makes sense. You see, it's totally in line with the social contract view. The view isn't that people agree to allow God to anoint someone. So that's a different view. And that might be a kind of social contract view. So maybe I need to actually be a bit more careful. There's no agreement, but so and so claims that God ordained them to rule, and then they thereby become sovereign. People follow suit. Okay, that wouldn't be based on consent at all. Okay. Okay, so hopefully my clarification helped out. Okay, so what next? Sorry, let me see if I can get back on track here. Here we go. So the nature of Hobbes's original contract. So we have this original contract. Hopefully we roughly understand it. Any questions about it? Always feel free to let me know. Happy to help. This is one of those areas where students sometimes have questions. So we have the citizens or the subjects. I think in the text that I had you read, the citizens are typically called subjects. That's terminology used there. But then you have the sovereign. And if I were to do this a little bit better, I'd have the sovereign, the line drawn a little bit higher up. But let's not be representative of the number of individuals necessarily. So we have the sovereign and the citizens. This is a political society that has this kind of structure. Okay, the rulers and the ruled. So what's the nature of a political society? Something like this. Okay. So according to Hobbes, and of course, the ruler is the one who makes the laws, and then enforces the laws, etc. Okay, so that's the thing about political society. That's what's going on. We create earthly authority for the laws, right? Enforcing the laws. So according to Hobbes, citizens should make contracts with themselves. Thus, in the nature of the original contract is what we call horizontal only. So I've been alluding to this. I may be explicitly stating it, but I haven't been talking about this a horizontal bit. So the contract, the original contract, is between the citizens. It's not vertical. It doesn't go up and down. So the sovereign isn't subject to the social contract. So the consequence of this is that there isn't also a vertical contract. There's only a horizontal one between the citizens. The sovereign thus is not subject to the original contract. It is not subject to any contract with respect to the citizens or subjects it rules over. And here we're just talking about sovereign generally. At this stage of the Leviathan, the sovereign could be a monarch, it could be an assembly like an aristocracy, an assembly like the people, the masses. So it turns out, it may not be the easiest to see this at this point, but it turns out this is the basis for Hobbes' view that sovereign should have absolute authority. Okay. When we think about the nature of the original contract, that the contract be horizontal and not also vertical. Okay. So what's Hobbes' argument for absolute authority? Okay. I think there's several arguments for it, but I'm picking out one of them so we can get a flavor of the way Hobbes argues for it. This is page 81 of the text. So it's later, chapter 18 of the text, which I didn't have you read. I'll just give you this passage to know from it. But feel free to read it and chat with me about it. Besides, if one or more of the subjects claims a breach of the covenant made by the sovereign in his becoming sovereign, so suppose the original contract establishes the sovereignty of the sovereign, right? The authority to rule of the sovereign. There's a lot of sovereignty there. And one or more other subjects contend that there was no such breach. Okay, so there's a sovereign who's been given the authority to rule. If we're supposing that there were contract holding, there were vertical contract holding, and one or more of the subjects citizen says, "Hey, the sovereign has violated the contract," and then others come along and say, "Well, no, no, he hasn't," or "No, they haven't." Or indeed only if the sovereign himself contends. It might be the case that the sovereign says, "You're contending that I violated the contract, but I disagree with you." There's no judge to decide the controversy. So it returns to the sword again. We go back to war. We return to a kind of state of nature, which is a state of war. And every man regains the right of protecting himself by his own strength, contrary to the design they had in the institution of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is just the political society, where the purpose of the political society is our common weal, and weal is the term for well-being. So we think about commonwealth, we're talking about our common well-being, and that's what political societies are designed for, according to Hobbes. So that's why he oftentimes calls them commonwealths. He's not alone in this; others do in the tradition as well. Kind of cool. Okay, kind of cool terminology. Common weal, which means commonwealth. Okay. Okay. So let's see if we can sketch this argument. Okay. So here's the reconstruction of the argument in a step-by-step way of putting it. Okay. I call it a reconstruction because you're not going to see it laid out like this in the text. I'm just trying to make it clear in case it's not. Okay. So what we do is we suppose that the sovereign makes contracts with its subjects. The form of argument here is reductio ad absurdum, and this I think follows the text. You have to look carefully at the text to show you where this happens, but for now, at least, just trust me that the way Hobbes argues for the claim that the sovereign doesn't make contracts with the subjects and that the original contract is purely horizontal is by supposing that that there's also a vertical contract, and showing that absurdities result when we do that. So we should then claim that what we've supposed, for argument's sake, doesn't hold. So we're supposing the sovereign makes contracts with its citizens for reductio, what we call reductio ad absurdum, in order to show that this claim reduces to absurdity. That's what the Latin means here, reductio ad absurdum. Okay, a proof by contradiction, sometimes it's called. We saw this already in our discussion of Plato's Euthyphro, remember? So, so this is the form of argument we're using. It ended up getting formalized later in the tradition. Hobbes would have been really well aware of it in his education. Okay, Oxford educated. I'm sure they taught him the basics of logic and argumentation. So one, which follows from our supposition, is that the sovereign can breach its contract. So if the sovereign can make contracts with its citizens, then presumably the sovereign can breach or break the contract, violate the contract. So then two, if a sovereign can breach its contract, then someone has the authority over the sovereign to breach, to enforce the breach. Okay. So the sovereign can break the contract or violate its contract, then presumably there has to be some authority over the sovereign. It wouldn't make sense to say that the sovereign breaches his contract or its contract if there's no enforceability. So remember, the enforceability point comes back here. We call it E above. And then three, from 1 and 2 in logic, the rule here is what we call modus ponens for those of you who are interested here. We go ahead, whoops, let me go back. So this is modus ponens. You just trust me on the logic for now. If you want further discussion, let me know. So from 1 and 2, we get 3 for free. Someone has the authority over the sovereign to enforce the breach. 4, so by 3, this is a trivial implication of 3. Someone has authority over the sovereign. So if someone has the authority over the sovereign to enforce the breach or any of the breaches that the sovereign makes, then presumably it just follows from that someone has authority over the sovereign. Okay. There's a sovereign over the sovereign in general. Okay. But 5, but nobody has authority over the sovereign. There's no sovereign of the sovereign. The sovereign is sovereign. Okay. If there's a sovereign over the sovereign, then that sovereign over the sovereign would be sovereign. But then we could ask, couldn't we, in that case, who's sovereign over the sovereign over the sovereign? You see how this would go on forever if we kept going? Okay. This is sometimes most referred to as an infinite regress argument that we find in chapter 18 of Hobbes' Leviathan for absolutism, for the absolute authority of the sovereign. Okay. So anyways, 4 and 5 contradict. So there's your absurdity, right? You really could have moved from 3 to 5 if you wanted to, but I'm drawing a trivial implication from 3 to 4. Okay. So so from 3 to 4, it's a logical rule. This is if oops, I gotta get out of here. And this is 3 and logic. The rule, for those of you who really like the logic, usually I have a small percentage of students who are interested in the logic. I don't want to alienate them. This is called existential generalization. Okay, in our predicate logic, in our use of quantificational logic. Okay. Again, for those of that's really for just those of you interested. Otherwise, you can trust me and talk about it in office hours or through email if you're interested. And then, so the absurdity is the contradiction. That's the most common way of establishing absurdity. So we've reduced our supposition to an absurdity, so we can reject it. Therefore, the sovereign doesn't mean contrast with its subject. And we should think therefore, and then from this, we should conclude, well, as we're giving advice to those who are leaving a safe nature form political society, we should give the advice that that the original contract involve only a horizontal agreement among the subjects or citizens themselves, and that's what establishes the political society and the authority of the political society, all things being equal. So what about the right to revolution? Well, it's going to turn out that Hobbes' commitment to the sovereign's absolute power implies that there's no political right to revolution. If the sovereign's right is absolute, that means the sovereign can do whatever the sovereign sees fit. Now, as you can imagine, many take exception to this, okay? And perhaps rightly so. Like Hobbes's political philosophy didn't win the day. There are certain features of it that are very nice and are helpful, I think, about the state of nature. Even if he doesn't get the details right there, it's still like, wow, he developed it in a very interesting way. That's worth thinking about, that maybe could be improved upon. Potentially Locke does that. We'll have to see. But the right to revolution is ruled out because right to revolution would suggest, wouldn't it, that the sovereign has become tyrannical, oligarchical, or descended into mob rule, whether we're considering a sovereign that's a monarch, an aristocrat, or aristocratic, or democratic. Okay. So when you have your sovereign, you better pick wisely. And there's no utopia here. There's no guarantee that your sovereign is going to be one that can be fully trusted. Okay, so but on Hobbes' view, there's a similar problem with any form of government. You have to just sort of go with the least bad, the one that's least likely to be bad. So is it going to be is it going to be a monarch who's not enhancing the well-being or helping with the self-preservation of the citizenry? Will it be, the oligarchs who are looking out for themselves and not others, or will it be the majority of people in a democracy who create a kind of mob rule and thus create unsafe, uncertain, very insecure world for people? So power is absolute, no political right to revolution. So there's no breaching of contracts. There's nothing like that. Then we're going to create a constitution which limits the power, because there's no such thing. There's no constitutional monarchy here. It's being called for. No constitutional sovereignty being called for here. Okay, absolute authority of the ruler. Okay, but he does advocate the natural right to self-preserve. Okay, so at one and the same time, he's saying there's no political right to revolution, but if a monarch makes your life less secure, you have the right to defend yourself and self-preserve. Okay, you just are likely to get crushed. You get a critical mass of people together who feel like you do, feeling less secure and all the rest. Well, when that critical mass happens, then you can take on the sovereign. But then you just start all over. Now you're in a state of nature, which is a state of war. And then you have to get to original contracting again and go from there. So now we're in a position like, okay, what form of government should we choose? Monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy? Okay. Some say monarchy, oligarchy, democracy. That's fine. It's just sometimes the way Hobbes writes is oligarchy is used pejoratively when aristocracies go wrong. So I bolded one because that's the one that Hobbes argues for. he gives several considerations. I'm teasing out one to think about here from chapter 18. Chapter 18. Make sure I'm right about that. I want to make sure I get that right. In case you want to check it out yourself, I want to make sure I got that right. Why don't these go down further? So I'll just go. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. No, that's good. That's good. All right, yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to be quick, but not as quick as I wanted to be. So let's get back to the slides here. Anyway, page 87. And so here's the passage I wanted to capture for his argument for monarchy. A monarch can't disagree with himself out of envy or self-interest, but an assembly can. And the disagreement may be so strenuous as to lead to a civil war. So the disagreement with an assembly will lead to something like factions, and factions forming can descend into civil war. But that's just the state of nature, which is a state of war emerging. So the argument that I'm teasing out here from this passage is that monarchy seems like it's less likely to lead to a disagreement in faction than sovereignties based on assembly. Those are aristocracy and democracy. Okay. So this means that monarchies are least likely to degenerate into states of nature, which are states of war. But we've already seen how horrific states of war are, states of nature and states of war are. So we should adopt the form of government that is least likely to degenerate into such a state of nature, state of war. So not just political philosophy application to Hobbes number 1 through 6. I just want to come back to this. This was slide 10, if I remember correctly from above. The nature of political society we talked about. Okay, it has this structure, right? According to Hobbes, you don't have a society until you have a political society. You just have loose collections of individuals, little atoms, as it were, of individuals. But you don't have a society yet until you have a political society. The justification of political society is a state of war argument. The laws of nature used to guide us, where we have an obligation, right, a command to seek peace, to self-preserve, to improve our well-being. The best ways to organize political society, right? Absolutist, monarchist, okay? So we've seen responsibility and rights of the citizens. Well, citizens will have the responsibility of following the laws that the sovereign creates. The rights that the citizens have will be a smaller set of them than they had in their natural state. And these things will get worked out with the original contract. We've just talked about a sketch of it, but there's a lot more that you can build in, as it turns out, for Hobbes. Same thing with the responsibility and authority of governments. Responsibility of the government is to ensure the well-being of its citizenry, and the authority for Hobbes is absolute. And we saw his theory, at the very least, of justice. He doesn't think that we're equal in any kind of moral sense, but justice seems to be this like fundamental idea for him. We're just when we keep our contracts, and we're free. We're more free in a way in a political society than in a state of nature, because we'll have the relevant protections in a political society. So more could be said on this, but this is just to give you, a flavor, as I've said, of Hobbes' political philosophy and applying these various topics in political philosophy to what we learned about Hobbes. There he is again, good old Hobbes. And that's the end of what I've got on Hobbes. So really stop sharing, and I'll wish you all well. If you have questions about the Hobbes, let me know. Next video will be on John Locke, but feel free in the meantime to reach out. Let me know what clarifications you might have on anything that I've said in this video or any of the other videos. So again, I wish you well. Take care. Bye-bye.